Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ELN Live event, Lessons Learned from a School Lockdown with Jeff Sefcik and Jeremy Schmidt. My name is Arlen Peebles with the Illinois Principals Association. I will be your host. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things in the GoToWebinar control panel. The first is your audio panel. Most of you are logged in listening with your computer speakers. Your microphone is muted, and that's how it will remain throughout the session. So don't be concerned about that. As long as you can hear me, you are doing great. If you have any trouble with the audio, there is the option to switch over to the telephone. Under that little audio tab, there's a conference number for you to join there if you have trouble with the speakers. Also, the handouts pod, I have uploaded their PowerPoint as a PDF, so you can download that, follow along, print it out, and have it for your records as a resource. Got a great outline and timeline of what these guys experienced during the lockdown day. Also, the questions pod. This is for you to use at any time. If you have questions for Jeff or questions for Jeremy as they are talking through this morning, type them in as soon as you think of them. We will hopefully have about 5 minutes at the end to address some of those questions. So as you think of a question, pop it in there. If it's for me, type it in there as well, and I'll address it as we go. I would like to turn it over now to our principals here and welcome Jeff Sefcik and Jeremy Schmidt. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Arlen.
Thanks for having us.
So as Arlen said, my name is Jeff Sefcik. I'm the principal at Stanton Middle School with Jeremy Schmidt. He's the principal at Grant Community High School. We are about 3 football fields away from each other. My students feed into his high school. So we've worked together here the last several weeks to put together what we hope is an informative presentation. And like Arlen said, please don't hesitate to ask any questions throughout. In the last slide, you'll see does have our contact information on there. So if you do have any questions when we're done and the presentation's through, shoot us an email and we'll do the best we can to help out. So we're going to start out with a little demographic information.
Thanks, Jeff. Again, welcome everybody. I'm Jeremy Schmidt, principal at Grant Community High School. I've been here since since exactly 2005, and I've been in this role for the last 3 years. And I also am excited to share our experience with the principal community so that hopefully we can all learn from our experience and apply some of those lessons to your buildings. So Grant Community High School, as you can see, it's a single high school district. It's in northwest Lake County, and we're unique in the fact that we pull from 9 different villages. So we have a unique population, I think, because of that. We have just under 2,000 students, so about approximately 1,950. Our certified staff members include 120 and 11 administrators. And I think that's pertinent information as we're going through the course of events of the day and some of those takeaways so that you can kind of understand the scope of what we're dealing with in relation to the number of students and staff, administrators, and what our high school demographics look like.
So as you can see, we are a much smaller school, so hopefully we can kind of cross the grade levels and sizes of school throughout the states here and kind of represent both the big and the small. So we're a 5'8" building. This is my 11th year as an administrator at Stanton School, and I believe my 7th as the principal. So we hover somewhere around 300 students most of the year. We have 28 certified staff members, and then it's myself and an assistant principal.
The event that prompted both of our schools and the whole area, but both of our schools are going to lockdown, took place on September 1st, 2015. Many of you are likely aware of it. It was highly publicized. It was on national news, it was on local news for weeks, but that event was something that certainly I think captured a lot of the media attention for certainly that few days, weeks, and in subsequent months as well. The event took place when an officer was found killed, and the massive manhunt that ensued afterwards, which included a multitude of local law enforcement and as well as state law enforcement as well. And as we talk about this, I think that's one thing that makes this event unique in a lot of ways, was the amount of kind of media attention that went along with it. And I think that certainly, for our building anyway, played into the way that we communicated and disseminated information, et cetera, because of the public nature of things.
Okay, so as I mentioned in our first slide, we are about 3 football fields away from one another. So you can kind of see from the yellow thumbtacks up in your top right corner of your screen there is Grant High School. And you can kind of see how their campus kind of sprawls all the way from, you can see the parking lots as the streets run together there at the corner, all the way to the baseball field. And then the baseball field, if you hit a foul ball, it often lands in our parking lot. So you can see our school there, Stanton School, the yellow thumbtack in the middle, a much smaller campus, but very close to Grant. And then as the crow flies, the red circle with the yellow thumbtack there, I haven't measured that exactly, but I'd say that's like 3 to 5/10 of a mile away from our building, and then another 300 yards or so away from Jeremy's building. So I know you've heard, if you've watched the news coverage about the concrete plant, that's the actual concrete plant there, and if you watched some of the helicopter coverage, you can see where the marshy area starts there below the concrete plant where some of the searches went. And throughout the day, we listened to police scanners and tried to, get as much information as we could to know what was going on and where it was happening. And several announcements included some of the streets that you see there between the concrete plant and Stanton School. So as we were in the heat of the moment, we really felt like there were these 3 perpetrators either hiding or trying to get away in our area. So at the time, it was a very, very serious situation. The emergency response plan, that's an actual picture of our booklet that we use. And as you can see there, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through, and we're a little bit different than how Grant does it, and Jeremy will mention how they do theirs. But we have basically 3 different color-coded systems. So we have a blue code blue, which is in the community. There could be a bank robbery taking place a few miles downtown in our community. That would be a blue. We have a code yellow. We are in a neighborhood. There could be a domestic dispute across the street. I mean, there's houses right across the parking lot outside my office window. And then a code red is actually the situation is inside the building. So I'll get into more detail about this as we go, but one of the things that, one of the lessons that I think that we learned from this situation is there isn't always a color code for what's happening. So is there an orange? How do you add a different color when you haven't practiced it and drilled it and it's not in your book?
And, looking at today's focus, kind of a caveat or a segue from Jeff's point regarding the lessons learned, and we're really going to be focusing on that, the importance of flexibility and the decision making that comes along with that. And similar to Jeff's plan, we have a lock-in and a lock-down. Our lock-in plan is relatively comparable to Jeff's code blue. So a lock-in for us means that we follow our same bell schedule, but we lock all the outside doors. Nobody comes in or out, but we continue our day virtually as is without any students entering or community members, anyone entering or exiting the building. Essentially, there's something going on in the community that prohibits free access to the building, but we can continue our day. The more serious of the 2 plans for us is a lockdown, which is similar to Jeff's code red, which was designed for a threat in the building. And as Jeff alluded to, we really had to make some pretty, what I would call, difficult decisions throughout the course of the day when deciding how closely to follow the prescribed plan and what the responsibilities of were people within that plan, if we're going to deviate from it at all, how we're going to deviate and what the ramifications of that might be. So really that leads us to some of the bigger takeaways about looking at our emergency response plans as a whole, and some of the strengths, weaknesses, and ways that we can hopefully improve those. And hopefully for everyone who's listening, hopefully that's some of the things that you could take back to your own buildings and your own teams and have some quality discussions about. We've set up the presentation so that we follow a timeline of events. However, our focus is going to be more on the lesson learned and some of the takeaways. But we didn't feel we could appropriately address those lesson learned or any takeaways without going through some of the details of our day. And our school day starts at 7:40 in the morning. We have students present, and that's when period 1 begins. So as you can see, we had the emergency take place during first period here. We have 50-minute class period, so approximately just about all the way through, halfway through that first period was when we saw front office witness, our school resource officer, leaving the building because he received an emergency call. And that was really it was an anomaly kind of event to see our resource officer run out the building in distress. And in particular, because that in many ways, shapes, and forms, we rely on that individual for all sorts of things, particularly in a lockdown kind of event. So as we went throughout the course of the day, we didn't have a resource officer because he was needed out in the community. But he did leave at approximately 8:17. And just a few minutes later, our superintendent, Dr. Sefcik, received a call that the building needed to go in lockdown. And fortunately, we did have all of our hands on deck from an administrative standpoint and a dean standpoint of people who have responsibilities in a lockdown and a lock-in. So we were fortunate to have everyone here that day. But at that point, just a minute or two later, we received that information and then made the call out that we were going into a lockdown. Our SRO called at 8:36 and indicated that we do need to remain in lockdown. From that point on, we really operated going forward as knowing under the presumption that we were in dire straits. And we spent those first few minutes trying to assess the situation and essentially determine exactly what was going on in the building. And when that resource officer did call and indicated to us the context of the situation, some of that stress was relieved. But not, having all the information at that point, we were, obviously treating this as a hard and fast lockdown. It was, really only 20 minutes later that our superintendent did put out our Sky Alert, which is our parent communication that goes out electronically to all parents who are signed up through, we use Skyward for that communication, indicating that we were in a lockdown. And it was in that same time frame that we then cleared the front office to begin answering calls. And this, I think, is an important point for me because this wasn't something that was part of our plan necessarily, a prescribed part of our plan, but we did have to make a call of how we're going to communicate and when. And this isn't something that's written, it's something that's agreed upon. Administratively, we always made it a priority to keep community members, parents informed about what's going on in the building, but our first priority is students. So as you'll see, we go out throughout the timeline of the building, of the day rather. We try to coincide all the communication that went out to families with a PA announcement so that information was uniform. So we're aware, believe on a presumption that parents were going to be trying to communicate with students via text or phone call, and we wanted that communication to go out in a uniform manner. In terms of the information that the front office was communication, we actually came up with a little script for them so that it essentially encompassed, we're in a lockdown per the Fox Lake Police Department, there's an emergency outside the building, it is not in the building, all students are safe. And we just continually harped on those same several points throughout the course of the day. And this communication piece I was alluding to is really important, I think, from a lesson learned perspective. The content of that communication, as I mentioned, the uniformity of it, the timing of it, how frequently do we believe is appropriate to communicate with parents, students, staff members, and then the methods of communication so that all stakeholders were included. And because of the nature of this event, we did have media considerations as well. And we did have all day long. Media was around our building trying to communicate with us in a variety of ways. The media was actually trying to get a hold of students as well throughout the course of the day. So keeping our communication uniform and timed appropriately was something that we certainly have as a takeaway lesson, is something that we now are better informed about going forward.
And even though we're so close, some of the differences, of course, with the content of the communication, Jeremy's dealing with 15 to 18-year-olds where I have 10-year-olds in my building. So how do I communicate that it's not a drill, that it is a serious matter without, overemphasizing to the point where you've got a 10-year-old experiencing some anxiety. So that was something that I was really focused on, and wanted to make sure that middle school students, as you know, as middle school principals out there, sometimes get nervous and giggly, that we can't be that way, that this is serious, but I didn't want to be over the top. Timing of the communication, even though, again, that we're right down the street from one another, we do not have an SRO. So as Grant found out from their SRO, we found out, and with this we'll go into this in our timeline here, from a 911 call. So this I think, and this kind of just popped into my head, this is very important that you get together with your community leaders, which we do every year with our fire and police and EMTs, but we, for the first time this past summer, got together with our 911 response center. Our mayor called us all together, so the leaders of the schools and the community leaders were involved, and we all exchanged cell phone numbers, and the process of getting the information out was done very well. So though Jeremy knew a little bit before we did, we knew within minutes. So actually it was kind of interesting how this happened. I was in the cafeteria. We don't start until 8:30. So I have students in the building, and the bell had just rang for them to go from the main area in our cafeteria where we start our day to class. So the majority of the kids, when I got the 911 call, were already in their classrooms. There were a few students that were kind of still at their lockers, but they were close to their classrooms. So I got the alert. I was kind of, our building isn't very big, but I was like on the other side of our building. So as I went to the office, I noticed a gentleman walking across the door, which kind of made me alert to, okay, something's going on. Who is this gentleman? And it happened to be one of the PE teachers from Grant. Their property is adjacent to ours, so they were closer to our building. Their PE class, because it was their first period, was closer to our building. And in our drills, we share each other's space when we need to. So they were actually entering the building as I was receiving the call. So my first response was to figure out who this gentleman was, and thankfully it was one of Jeremy's teachers. So I immediately at that point had the Grant High School PE classes with their teachers, and there was a male and female instructor go into our locker rooms. So that's where they were housed for the entire lockdown period. We initially called it a code blue because that was the information that I had received from the 911 emergency center. So basically all outside windows and doors are locked, and we do not have air conditioning in our building. So all of our windows were open at that time in our classrooms. So windows are closed and locked, blinds are drawn, doors are locked, no one's allowed in or out of the building. And at 8:30, when our day actually officially starts, my assistant principal and I, we walked through the building to make sure that everybody was where they were supposed to be, because the initial call was somewhere in the community. So we weren't directly in the line of any type of a situation. So we had time to go and make sure all the teachers, were calm, the kids were safe. We instructed our teachers to take attendance at that time. And then by 8:40, calls were made. We did have several students who were unexcused, and we had to make sure that all students were accounted for, so that we knew they were safe, and again, were they involved. So that was something that we had to look at. As we began to make sure that kids were in safe places, one of the things that we had to change throughout the day, and it happened relatively quickly, and you'll see it in the timeline here in a minute, We did get a phone call that was an officer down, and it was very close. We didn't get an exact location, but we knew it was within a half a mile or so. So at that point, I reevaluated and said, we have windows in almost all of our classrooms, so there's no threat inside, but there may be 3 perpetrators with the officer's gun, with possibly other guns, that may be running through our soccer field here in a minute. So I made the decision to clear out all of our students from any of the areas that had windows, any of the classrooms that had windows. So we took the majority of our kids and put them in our gym, in our library, and neither of those are both in the internal part of our building. And then we have 2 pod-style areas. So I took the 4 classrooms that have the pods that have outside windows and moved them to the inside of the building. So at that point, then we had to kind of refocus on our attendance to make sure that where our teachers are, where our kids are with our teachers, did a kid or 2 get pulled in because they were at their locker and they're with somebody else. So at that point, we really had to make sure 100% we knew where everybody was at that time.
From a attendance standpoint, we relied very heavily on our Skyward system for staff to take attendance and account for them. You can see in this next hour breakdown of time, we did have a student who was not on campus and had been marked absent, who was actually accounted for by the police. And I got a call from a Fox Lake police officer indicating that they had a student, and we were verbally identifying that student, and I was checking attendance to confirm that he was supposed to be with us and whether or not he'd been called in, etc. So whereas Jeff was really, I think, had a pretty intimate handle on almost, every kid and where they were, the size of our building really, prohibits me from doing that. So we relied very heavily on accurate attendance from classroom teachers. Another lesson takeaway from this, hour time period here for me was how to deal with parents. So communication had been out. This is a very public event. It's very close to our building. And we actually had a parent come on campus, and we had multiple. But one individual was actually, got out of their car and was at the building and demanding the release of his son. And it was at that point, from a lessons learned perspective, we had to decide how we're going to address this. I mean, we know that by the letter of our plan, we're not opening the door for anybody. And that's pretty straightforward. But then we also had to account for the fact that we had somebody outside who was very vocal and was, really demanding some things that we couldn't do. And, we did address that individual. We knew who that person was. This was, again, something in hindsight. I'm not sure how we would handle that again faced with that, but we did actually go out and address that individual and did not release the student, obviously, could not assure him of that student's safety, and request that he leave the premises. But again, felt like we were in a pretty vulnerable spot there, and having to make a call between leaving somebody outside our campus, who was, again, had some demands that we couldn't fulfill, or requests that we couldn't fulfill. And so that's something that, in hindsight, I think is, definitely a question mark for me. And I think, for all of you who are in attendance, something that if you haven't addressed how you might handle that, something that is, certainly worth considering. The other thing that I'd just point out in this timeline is that that's not part of our formal plan, but we did throughout the course of the day. It was about every 40 minutes or so, I made an announcement. Again, I created a script and read the same announcement every single time, which included my name, identified myself, and that we were still in a lockdown, that the building remained safe, and that we adhere to the protocol, etc. Just to hopefully ease anxiety and tension about, students who are starting to maybe get a little bit antsy. We've been in a lockdown for an hour at this point, and try to re-communicate the severity of the situation to them.
And that's one of the major differences between our 2 facilities. Where Jeremy was because of the size of the building and actually multiple locations of the building, he did his communicating over the PA system, where we did very little communicating over the PA system because we're so small. I thought it was important because of the age of our students to make sure that we were seeing them in person and letting them see us so that they were calm throughout the event. So I would say our goal was every 15 to 20 minutes, either myself or my assistant principal, and that, like I said, there was only, I want to say 6 locations of students. So we went to each of those areas and let everybody know, okay, this is what we know to the best of our ability with, again, not giving too much information out. You guys are safe. We're going to be fine, just to make sure that our kids, felt comfortable throughout the day. So as I said earlier, in our timeline here, we did actually receive information at about 9 o'clock that it was an officer that was down. And that's when I made, so about a half an hour we were in a blue, and that's when I made a decision, and this is not in any of our plans, to move away from any windows, because my fear was not somebody trying to break into our building to harm our kids. My fear at that point was, could there be a shootout in the parking lot, or could there be a shootout on our soccer field or our playground, and could a bullet enter our building through a window? So that's when I made that decision, and my assistant and I went from room to room, and we actually escorted the students with their teachers to the locations that are on the screen there. And then again at 9:10, we took a second round of attendance, compared it to the first round, made sure that all students were accounted for, and then we also used Skyward, so the rosters were printed off, and then instead of, just for an example, Mrs. Olson's class being in room 15, we just marked on the top of that roster, Mrs. Olson's class is now in the gym. So if we had to find her, any of her students throughout the day, we knew where to go. Our first message then went out from our superintendent via a Connect 5 alert system, which is a phone system, at 9:34. And as Jeremy mentioned earlier, he said all hands were on deck administratively. Our superintendent is actually, his office is at our grade school, so we're a 2-school district. But it just so happened that he was there the morning of this event. So he was actually on his way out of the building as the call came in. So he came back and was very helpful with communicating. His role was to communicate with the community, and then also the school board members that were calling with questions and that. So my main focus was on the students and on the staff. And then, I mentioned a little bit earlier, and we have a color-coded system. Jeremy has the hard and the soft, and I know probably every school has a different way of doing it. But at the point that we found that it was an officer down, at that point at 9 o'clock, in the location that it had happened, and the manhunt that was going on, there was a really good chance that one of the 3, if not all 3 of the perpetrators were going to be on their way in our direction. So how do I, as the building administrator, go from a blue to a color that we don't have? So at that point, this might have been a mistake that I made. I called it a code red with no one in the building. And we had never practiced that. And when people heard code red, their hearing just shut down. And in kind of debriefing in the next several days, some of these staff questioned that they didn't hear the no one in the building piece. So that's definitely a lesson that we've learned. We've talked about, we haven't made a decision yet on is there an orange? But so at that point, I wanted everyone to understand that the code red threat was real, and it was close, but it was not in the building.
And that really gets to one of the main points for us here this afternoon or this morning, is that importance of flexibility. And that's, I think for us, the biggest takeaway is that you can have a plan, you can have it rehearsed, you can have staff members who, understand it and can execute it. But, our experience in this particular example, which we think would extend to other examples, is that you're going to have to make decisions that aren't in line with your plan. And in terms of the time limit events, really this kind of 10 o'clock, this 9:30, 10 o'clock, really there's a kind of line of demarcation where we started really having to modify our plan based on the situation, based on student needs, based on staff needs. So you'll start to see that that decision-making come into play more, and the modification of our plan really get highlighted here throughout the middle part of the day and then on into the afternoon as well. And one of the most notable things that we deviated from our plan in is that we allowed recognize the need to get students breaks and staff members breaks. We've been in lockdown now for approximately 2 hours. And again, our lockdown is designed for a threat in the building. And we had some communication with the Fox Lake Police Department about whether or not we could come out of lockdown and move into a lock-in. And they did not recommend that. They advised us to stay in a lockdown. And I can certainly realize why they were advising that, and we had to make the call to follow that advice or not. And we decided to with some modifications. So at 10 o'clock, we had the administrative team get together to modify our lockdown procedures. And what we essentially did was we kind of created a hybrid between our lock-in and lockdown, where we tried to maintain the integrity of the lockdown, where kids are in rooms, lights are off, kids are in corners, and there is no movement in the building, while allowing for some access to those classrooms and access to bathrooms. So we call those safety checks. And what we did was we took administrators who have specific assignments in lock-in events. So they might have a door, they might have a hallway, an area of the building they're responsible for securing and a lock-in. And we made those individuals point people for those locations for when rooms needed breaks, for when, as you'll see, we had to bring food in eventually, and for communication that had to go to and from those classrooms. So it was just after that meeting and after assigning those roles and clarifying how we were deviating from a lockdown while trying to maintain the integrity of that lockdown, that I made the announcement to over the intercom, over the PA, that we were remaining in lockdown. We recommunicated the severity of the situation, but that we were going to be performing safety checks from the administrative team, who was going to be identifying themselves by name and a certain knock on the doors to access those rooms. And we essentially allowed individuals at that point to take a few students at a time to use the washroom. So it was the primary impetus for those safety checks. So this is, again, a major deviation from our written plan, but something that we felt we needed to do based on student need and based on the events that were happening in the community that was putting us in this lockdown. A couple other big points during this course of this hour was that the Fox Lake Police did drop off that student who was unaccounted for, and we accounted for that individual and got them to a safe place. So that actually was fortunate, because we did get some communication then in person from a Fox Lake Police Department member, which I was very grateful for. And then our superintendent then sent out a second Sky Alert communication with parents in the hopes of keeping them on the forefront of what we were doing, that we're remaining in a lockdown, but that all students were safe. And that was, again, followed by an announcement to the whole staff.
Okay, and then as we move into the 10 to 10:45 time zone, there we, as I mentioned earlier, do not have air conditioning in our building. And if you remember, the temperatures were hovering around 90 degrees that day. So even at 10 o'clock in the morning, because all the windows were shut, and we had kids, multiple classes in singular areas, it was getting hot. So we had to figure out how were we going to get all of our students and staff either cold water or Gatorade. So we started to coordinate that at that point with our kitchen staff. And luckily, we had enough for the day, throughout the day, to make sure everybody was staying hydrated. And then, of course, what goes in must come out. So because we still didn't know exactly where the threat was, and most of our hallways have outside doors connected to them, and there's windows in the doors, we had to kind of come up with maybe the closest bathroom wasn't the safest bathroom to go to, so we kind of designed some safe routes and went room to room, my assistant principal and I, and let the teachers know that 3 boys and 3 girls accompanied by an adult could go to the bathroom. We went together. The students used the facility, and then instead of coming out one at a time, waited at the doorway of the bathroom there until everyone was done, and we all traveled back to the bathrooms together. And while that was going on, we started to, we understood this was going to be a while. So we started to design plans to figure out how we were going to serve lunch. Now, as a little school as we are, we have 4 wonderful women that work in our kitchen area. One was not there yet when the lockdown was called. So when she arrived, we had to not let her in the building. She was knocking on the door to get in the back, and the kitchen staff let her know she had to leave. We had another staff member too, our school psychologist called in. We would not allow her in. And to kind of go back to the beginning, we did have a parent in the building at the time, so she stayed in the office with us for the whole extent of the lockdown. And we had one parent that was just getting out of his car with his son to drop him off, and I just yelled out the front door that we're going into a lockdown. It's probably best that you go home. So at this point, again, we started to figure out what we were going to serve for lunch, because the hot lunch that we were getting ready to serve for the day wasn't going to work. So our kitchen staff had to figure out, and we'll go into it in the slide here, what we were going to serve.
An additional modification that we had to address, or modification to our plan as a result of a situation we had to address, was how to administer medication to students. And I'm sure everyone who's listening can attest to, you have a wide variety of student needs regarding medication, some that are elective, that they come get as needed, some that are kind of an optional sort of thing, and some that are life-threatening or required. And we had to cross that bridge. And we had our nurse, and we actually pulled a school psychologist who did not have students that she was responsible for, work together to go through and identify students who needed medications administered to them. So identified those individuals, and again, we used some decision-making process by which students who only absolutely needed medication were the ones who were given that medication to administer. And so the nurse then got that medication to the administrator responsible for the area where that student was, again, relying on that quality attendance taking, got it to that divisional or that area administrator, and then that medication was delivered to those students as needed.
And I think the thing that I learned here is you have to trust your staff. As the lead administrator, you can't do everything. So shout out to my assistant principal here. She took this. I never even thought about the medication. That would have been something I missed. So thank you to her for doing that. So you really got to trust your staff. Sorry about that. And again, Rochelle took the students that were most severe. We have some diabetics in the building. We need to make sure that was taken care of, and some students with some anxiety disorders. So I had nothing to do with the administration of the medication, and we do not have a nurse. So Mrs. Peters did a great job in administering the medications throughout the day.
The serving lunch issue that Jeff brought up, we also addressed that issue at Grant, and we started dealing with that earlier on, and coming up with a plan. We didn't put that in the timeline here, but we started addressing that probably around 10 o'clock or so, and we started realizing we were going to be in this for the long haul. And what we did, again, dealing with circumstances that were surrounding us and the resources that we had, we did actually serve the lunch that was available that day. So in some cases, kids got a wide variety of things that they may have had delivered to their rooms, but some of it was a school lunch. I think it was a sandwich of pork sandwich or something. So some of them actually got those things along the sides because that's what we had. We recognized that kids needed to eat, and we're going to need to eat, and we had the staff members here to prepare that. We supplemented them, gave them some help by using our support staff from the front office who did not have responsibilities. They were willing to go help in the kitchen as well, because we not only had to make the food, but then we had to come up with a plan to actually deliver that food to what I would call a large building to each classroom. So it was this point in the day where we had food service was beginning right around 11 o'clock here. We were using all the food that we had and water that we had, and obviously there was a garbage issue as well, so we had to address that at the same time. So we're really trying to feed and clean up all right at the same time while minimizing some of as much traffic as possible in the building, and certainly not allowing kids to be out and about. It was at 11, right in the middle of that lunch service, that we were continuing to make more frequent announcements that we are remaining in lockdown. Even though there are these security checks and food is being served, we need to remain in lockdown and uphold the integrity of this as much as possible. just before 1 that we made an announcement for anybody who may have been missed, because we did have some concerns about that. If the food service didn't know where a group was, we had kids in the locker rooms. We actually had some kids in the field house that were across the street, so we had to address that issue, that they were to contact the front office if they did not receive food service.
So as we started to talk to our kitchen staff, you know, they had to kind of start counting what we had other than what was being cooked. So we designed a ham sandwich, a box salad, wrapped PB&J, the Uncrustables, milk and water, and then the PB&Js, of course, caused, are there any students with peanut allergies? So this was the 3rd time we had to move some kids from their original location. So 5 students, actually, and a couple were from Grant's PE class, had to be moved to another location with a staff member so that they could eat there in a peanut-free, safe location. And then about 11:32, our superintendent, Mr. Donlin, sent out a second call to all district families with an update that our students are safe, that we're in communication with the Fox Lake Police, and all things are going as well as they can. And the majority of our students take their medication around the lunch period. So that's when Mrs. Peters really went into action with getting our medication distributed. And while students were eating, I sat down with the superintendent and with our assistant principal, and we started to discuss what we would need to do to be prepared for dismissal if and when that happened. Shortly after that discussion started to take place, we did finally get our first visit from 2 Fox Lake Police Department officers, both that are very familiar with our students, been on the force for many years. Actually, one of the officers was a big part of our DARE program over the years. So it was good to see them. They did confirm, you know, at that point who the officer was, but that was just between the administration and the police department at that time. So they asked if they would, you know, be able to go from each of the locations and let the kids know that that they're safe and give them some confidence. We did do that. We walked them to the 6 areas at that point. And many, like I said, many of my students know the 2 officers that were there, so that was great. And then at 12:30, again, what goes in has to come out. We did our second round of safety route bathroom breaks.
It was after our lunch service concluded at approximately 1 o'clock here. The superintendent did send out another 3rd Skylar communication, followed up by an announcement by me over the intercom to again remain in lockdown. Food service did conclude, and really that marked the time of the day when we had talked about it, but hadn't, you know, concretely started determining what we're going to do regarding the possibilities for dismissal. Our dismissal time is typically at 3:10. We do allow some seniors who have a free period to have an early release for that last period of the day for our 11th hour. So we had to address those students as well. And we knew that that time was going to be rapidly approaching, so we started having more formal conversations about that at this time of day. Again, at 2, we announced the superintendent sent out a 4th Skylar communication for the afternoon, which was very similar to the previous 3, but further communicating that there would be no early dismissal. I coincided an announcement with the PA, communicating that with all staff and students as well. At 2:20 approximately, we did have the Illinois State Police arrive here, and this was our first formal communication or in-person communication with the Illinois State Police, and they, you know, certainly have a presence to them and a degree of authority that, you know, I think is, you know, really, you know, outstanding and, you know, deserves a lot of merit. And when they came in, we, you know, were able to discuss with them what our options were for dismissing and then their perspective on what would be safe. And up until about 2:45, we had a variety of options that we were trying to, develop or had developed based on, any number of circumstances that we thought might unfold. And one of those did include, and one that we were hoping to be able to execute, was actually using our buses to somehow, in coordination with the police, escort those buses and get kids on them, escort those buses to their stops and locations, and get kids home safely that way, which was one course of action that we were planning on taking or hoping to take. It was then at 2:45 that the police lieutenant, Illinois State lieutenant, communicated with us that our buses would not be available. And we knew that was going to be a possibility because our bus barn, or a location where we keep our transportation, is very near that concrete plant that you saw in the initial slide. So we had actually, throughout the course of the afternoon, communicated with our bus drivers, got our bus drivers to a safe location, and we're going to use a minibus to actually get all of them to their buses at one time via police escort, and then get the buses out of that location so that they could become available to us. But unfortunately, that did not work. We weren't able to secure that. So it was really at 2:45, and again, our day typically ends at 3:10, and we knew we had kids in lockdown here, approaching 6-7 hours, and then some, that we really were, faced with some pretty critical decisions about how we were going to, how and when we were going to be able to reunify students with their parents.
So as you can see, our superintendent, Mr. Donlin, sent out a third communication to all district families with another update. And around 2 o'clock, we had approximately 15 state police officers arrive at Stanton, and the gentleman in charge just asked, how can we help? So again, my concern was being so close that something would happen on our perimeter. So we actually walked the school, all 15 officers and myself, and I just said, can I get 2 officers here? Can I get a squad placed on the middle of our soccer field with an officer here? And basically built a perimeter of the state police around our building. And if we weren't sure yet how serious this was at that point, I was really sure, because I don't know what kind of guns they had, AK-47s, whatever they were, but it really kind of brought any questions that I might have had how real this was. I mean, that was taken care of at that point. And again, we don't dismiss until 3:05, so it was probably well into the 90s at this point as far as temperature goes in the building. So now we have to make sure that we get our students and staff taken care of, and also the state police officers that were outside in the heat, to make sure that nobody dehydrated at that point. So we made another round of drink delivery at that point.
As we worked with the Illinois State Police to develop a plan to release students and unify them with their parents, what we ended up developing was a plan where we're going to essentially do a few things. One, do a controlled release where students were going to be reunified with parents when parents arrived at specific points in the building. We'll get to that in a second. We have a map. We'll show you that. But we did make the call that we're going to allow individuals who drove who drove to school that day, because we do have, obviously being a high school, we have students who can drive to campus. We did have to cross that bridge and make that decision of what to do with them. And part of our plan was to allow them to drive home. And again, this was made in coordination with the Illinois State Police and their perspective on things. That was, a decision that we had to make, that again, from a lesson learned standpoint, is something that likely, I would, encourage you to address as well. But we'll go into detail of that plan in just a minute. But it was at 3:10 that the superintendent sent out the 5th and final Skylar communication with parents, indicating how dismissal is going to be run and what the reunification process is going to look like. I made a PA announcement at that point as well, regarding that same information, communicating specifically that information and process with students and faculty in the building, and then also sent out electronic communication so that staff members who had electronic access were able to get that information and reread it, and in the attempt again to avoid any confusion about what this process was going to look like. The reunification, continued all the way through that 5:30 timeline, and again, we'll go into some of those details in just a minute, the final slide here, but it wasn't until 5:40 that our last parent and student were unified.
So that's an actual picture of the locker room. You know, we're a typical small middle school where, 50-plus students from Jeremy's building, from their PE class, were housed for the 7 hours. So now, how are we going to get the students that are from Grant, from our building, over to their building so that they can be reunified? So I'll let Jeremy talk about that.
And this was something that ended up being, kind of a bigger issue than we would have anticipated, simply because we're so close. It seems like it would be relatively simple, but as you can imagine, when we have several thousand parents coming into our campus at the same time, several hundred parents in Jeff's building, we had quite the traffic jam. So we actually, and we obviously didn't want students just walking back, so I got a minibus. Our business manager got in the minibus and was making trips back and forth to safely get those students from Jeff's locker room back to our building. And again, the timing of that ended up being a confounding factor, because we had some of those parents were arriving at their designated time to pick up their sons or daughters, but they weren't here yet. So we had to, address that with them. Again, identify where their students were. So, again, relying on accurate attendance and communicating with them that they would be coming back shortly.
Okay, so this was something that I had mentioned in an earlier slide that we had started to prepare for our dismissal process several hours ahead of time. So at 3:03, Mr. Donlin sent the message out to all district parents with the exact instruction of how they were expected to arrive, what information they needed to have as far as identification, and how we were going to run our dismissal. So as I mentioned earlier, we did have approximately 15 state troopers with us, and the next slide will kind of show how our parking lot is different and how our dismissal is going to be different than Jeremy's because of the size of his building compared to mine. But what we did was, as the parents started to arrive, and the first parent arrived at about 3:15, and shortly thereafter there was a car, cars miles long down the main street that pulls into our parking lot. So you'll see in a minute there are actually two stop sign areas, kind of an L, that feed into the one entrance into our parking lot. So we had stationed a trooper at each of the stop signs that would stop and basically do a quick check of the car and then send one car in at a time. And I was approximately 20 yards into the parking lot with my secretary. You see Jill confirmed the person in the car was the person on the pickup list. She was there with a state trooper. So I would peek into the car. Many of the families I know, but there were some people that I didn't, so I asked for their driver's license. I would yell to Jill who that person was. Jill had already printed out every student in our building in their emergency contact list. Jill would confirm to me that that person was confirmed on the emergency pickup list. The state trooper then relayed into the office, because we do not have a walkie-talkie system. We relied on the troopers for this. Relayed into the office that so-and-so was here to pick up this student. Then on the PA system, my assistant would call into that area that we knew the students were at. We mentioned earlier how important it was to make sure we knew where everyone was. That student would come directly from their location to the office. The trooper would then escort that student into the car. The student would get into the car, the parent would pull out of the parking lot, and the next car came through. So that happened. That started at approximately 3:15. Last student was picked up at 5:30. And one of the other things, too, that I think was probably unique to us, many of our students live very close. So several parents actually walked to pick up their kids. So we had cars that we dealt with, and then we had parents that were walking. And of the 294 students that were picked up, we had one grandparent that wasn't on the emergency contact list. So one of the troopers just took her off to the side in the parking lot, made a phone call, confirmed verbally who that person was, and that was taken care of quite quickly. At 5:45, I re-entered the building to a staff of wonderful people who were all at the main office just waiting for the next set of instruction. Just let them know that they were great, that we would talk more later on in the evening about what we were going to do for the next day, dismiss them all, and then I did have the custodians just clean the areas, the 6 areas that we were. The building was shut down, and I was the last one to leave at 6:45.
The reunification piece that Jeff and I both alluded to was, something that we, again, had to, I think demonstrate a lot of flexibility in decision making with. Again, because based on the circumstances and the resources that we had, we, both had to make adjustments and, create and then communicate very specific plans. And on the bottom half of this slide, that's our main building, and the 2 blue dots indicate the dot on top, the northern dot there, was a location where we had identified parents were to come of freshmen and seniors. And we gave each class communicated a time for parents to show up for freshmen. So freshmen we set first, which I believe was right at 3:30, had to begin showing up there, and then that senior group was later. And so that time was, we tried to stagger those times to minimize some of the traffic. Now, whether or not parents listen to that, I can't speak to that exactly, because I know we had a lot of cars here, but we did attempt to stagger those times to make that reunification a little bit more orderly. And then that southern dot, or the southern location of the building with the second blue dot, that's where we had sophomores and juniors reunifying with their parents. And what we did was we essentially required parents to come. We set up a little perimeter. We had Illinois State Police all over the outside of our building, as well as at the reunification points. Parents identified themselves. We had a person with a walkie-talkie the front office, the main office, and then that name was relayed over the PA. And then that individual came down to that location where their parent was waiting. They remained in the building, and we escorted them to their parent who was waiting outside. So again, as a high school, we made the decision that we weren't going to go through with every single student, all of the, probably, I would say, 1,600 or so that were maybe left that didn't drive themselves home. We decided not to go through that process and check the skyward pickup list. And again, we made that call, assuming that high school students would be, able to, confirm whether or not the person they were going home with there was appropriate and safe, etc. Because that definitely would have taken us much, much longer than it otherwise had here. So we made that decision again at that time, and we are happy with it. One problem we did run into, which I would encourage everyone to consider, was that our reliance on the radios was heavy, and our radio communication quickly jammed up our lines. And so thanks to a quick thinking technology member of our team, they actually create an on-the-spot impromptu Google Doc. So we brought laptops out and created little stations there where parents could go through the identification process. We then put their names in the Google Doc. That Google Doc was shared with the front office, and then things really sped up from that point, because the front office was just able to read off names and locations. So things really picked up there. So that's something that I would consider for yourself going forward if you're ever in a position similar to this.
And then our picture is the one on top there. So I mentioned the L kind of 2 streets that lead in to our parking lot. So that's an actual photo from our front door. So you can kind of get a visual of the 2 state troopers, one in each of the L areas, that were kind of doing a visual check of the cars, and then I would wave them into the first arrow that you can see kind of by that car parked by itself there. That's where I would meet the parent and communicate with my secretary, and then they would move to the front of the building. So we moved less than 300. Jeremy moved a little less than 2,000 in approximately the same time. It took about 2 hours. So like Jeremy said, his kids are a little bit older. Many of them drove. So there were things that I just wanted to make sure that every student was accounted for, and they were going home with somebody that they knew and trusted and was on the emergency contact. So just a little bit, even though we're 300 yards away, just one of the many differences that we have.
To try to summarize the timeline there, and framing the context of our conversation over this past hour under lesson learned, I hope you saw that some of the continued kind of themes that we fell back on time and time again regarding flexibility and responsiveness, the types of plans that you have in in your building or in your district, and having to make modifications to those based on the circumstances. And then, relying on the staff that you have being well trained, and then them being good decision makers as well. In the context of this situation, it really was we counted on every single person in the building making good choices based on the circumstances. And, we couldn't be proud of our staff for doing that. And they really did a nice job, but that's something that's, definitely a takeaway. And, in terms of courses of action from that, we here are really looking at formally coming up with a reunification plan, and that's a massive undertaking. But solidifying that piece. Another takeaway for us is we realized that we had a lot of teachers in the building who might have had a free period during that time who were either not utilized or underutilized. And so in the future, we're going to formally identify those students who don't have, or teachers, who don't have a responsibility, and know that we could potentially use them in an area of need. We're also looking at creating a safe mode. We have created, a safe mode, which is a kind of hybrid between a lock-in and a lockdown, which will allow us to easily move from a safe mode into a lockdown. And so it kind of bridges that gap and creates that hybrid model that we're looking for while maintaining the integrity of the lockdown, which we think is important as well. That laptop carts and coming up with that Google Doc for reunification is something that we're have ready to go now. We have in the closet ready to go in case we ever need it. And then another piece, regarding technology was we have a full staff of technology individuals who, again, I think were not fully utilized. We went to them throughout the course of the day for things, but going forward, we're going to have them be a real part of the security team. Actually, we have video cameras all throughout the building, in the parking lots and things, and they're going to kind of be our security team going forward. So there's a few of the kind of big lessons learned that we are taken away from this.
And if I could just emphasize one thing that I want to make sure everybody thinks about is that we have great people working for us. So again, you can't do everything. If you try and do everything in a situation like this, you're going to drop a ball or two. Make sure you trust your staff, give them the authority to make decisions, and make sure you rely on them.
So at this point, I think Arlen was going to open up to some questions, if there are any. If there are people still around, we went a minute or two over our hour here. So if you do have questions, we'll certainly be open to that. But if we can't get to your questions, you want to reach out to either Jeff or myself, we'll certainly extend that courtesy of your email. I see we didn't put our phone numbers on here, but you can certainly go to either of our websites. You can get that information if you wanted to also. But, we welcome those conversations. And that's a big reason why we decided to do this, because we did get a lot of calls and requests from our peers and those of you who are out there, with specific questions. So if you do have any of those questions, we're definitely open to having those conversations.
So we're ready, Arlen. Any type of questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff and Jeremy. And we are at the 11 o'clock hour, so we totally understand. If you need to log out at this time, we're going to continue forward with some of the questions because they will be captured on the recording of this webinar. But of course, if we do not get to your question, don't hesitate again to reach out to Jeff or Jeremy. One of the first ones we had was regarding the school resource officer. Is that an off-duty officer or one of your staff members, Jeremy?
That school resource officer is an employee of Fox Lake Police Department who is stationed here, positioned here during the course of the school day. Okay.
And Jeff, did you have a school resource officer or not?
No, we do not.
Right. Okay. And Jeremy, this one's for you too. On your slide in the beginning, it said the superintendent receives the lockdown call. Kathleen wanted to clarify who made the lockdown call to you.
I believe that was a member of, it was either a resource officer who called to indicate that, and I believe that's the appropriate answer, or another member of the Fox Lake Police Department.
Okay.
I don't think we had that bullet point in there, but that we immediately obviously made that PA announcement and sounded the alarms at that point.
Okay, great. And in regards to that, when the call came into you, Jeremy, was it specified that it was a lockdown as opposed to a lock-in?
Yes. That was the communication we had that was consistent throughout the whole course of the day, and we did request to come out of lockdown, knowing what that was like for a student to be in a dark room in a corner for 7+ hours, but we were advised to remain in lockdown.
Okay, great. Jeff, this one's for you from Amber. How did the Grant PE students know to go to Stanton?
So they, because they have a resource officer, they found out a couple of minutes before I received the notification by text from our 911 center. So yeah, they have a wonderful walkie-talkie system. So when Jeremy and the administration was notified here at Grant, they were notified. Their two teachers were notified over the walkie-talkie, and they were much closer to my building. So they actually knew a couple of minutes prior. And as I mentioned, I was getting the notification from our 911 center as those students were actually entering our building. So there was a couple of minute delay based on the fact that we don't have a resource officer, but everything timed up, pretty nicely.
Okay, great. Thank you. This question from Vanita: did you guys have any car riders or walkers, and how did you handle those students as you went into lockdown?
Okay, so as they entered the building, or as far as the reunification piece goes?
Oh, that was as they were entering the building.
Okay, so for us specifically, we started at 8:30, and the lockdown call happened about 3 minutes prior to our actual start of first period. So all of our students were, we open our doors at 8:10, so there's a 20-minute kind of an entry where everybody comes into our cafeteria. And we all begin the day together there. I make some announcements. So I had just made the announcements. The students had just been dismissed to go to their lockers to go to the first period. So I think I mentioned there was a mom in our office that brought some books for her daughter that forgot her books, who spent the whole day with us. There was one other car that was just, the dad was getting out of the car as the lockdown was happening. So I had enough time to go out and yell out the door that we're going into a lockdown, so you're either going to have to come in and spend the day with us, or you need to go home. So they made the decision to go home.
Got it. Thank you. And I think this next one's for you, Jeremy, from Robert. What were examples of messages that the superintendent sent by Skylert?
Well, I don't have that example right in front of me, but it was very straightforward. I don't think any of them were more than maybe with the exception of the dismissal and reunification communication that went out at the end of the day. They're very straightforward and very consistent. Essentially indicated we are in lockdown. We're in communication with the authorities, including the Fox Lake Police Department. All students are safe, and the threat is outside the building, and that we were going to remain in lockdown and would communicate any changes as they took place, essentially. So it was very direct and as concise as possible.
Perfect. Okay, another question here from Kathleen. Did you allow parents to pick up other children, such as a carpool situation, or only their own at the high school?
At the high school, we did have, there were just a handful of examples of individuals who had to go home with somebody who wasn't their immediate family or their guardian. And we did, I know I personally talked to, in those cases, I talked to the parents who confirmed the individual who was there picking them up. So part of the communication that went out was that they had to be the guardian. And so parents largely followed that direction. And I think that was at the beginning of the presentation. I mentioned how the media coverage of this particular event I think was an obstacle in some ways for us, or a complicating factor in some ways, but in other ways it helped. And I think because many of the parents were probably at their desks or place of work or at home, wherever it is, watching these events unfold on TV, they understood the severity of it, and we had people generally following the directions that we were giving, and that was one of the directions we gave, that we wanted guardians there, or people on the approved list to come, so we didn't have too many instances where parents didn't follow that direction.
Great, thank you. And Faye wants to make sure she heard you correctly. You did or did not release the student to the parent who appeared at the door demanding the child's release?
I did not.
Got it. Okay, thank you. From Robert, did you allow students who drove to school to drive themselves after release?
I'm sorry, can you ask that question again, Arlen?
Did you allow the students who drove themselves to school to drive themselves home after the release?
Yes, we did. And that was the first group that we let go, and was a very difficult decision to make. And again, that was something that we relied pretty heavily on the Illinois State Police, who were there with, coordinating and taking their advice of whether or not that was going to be safe to allow that. So we had a heavy police presence out in that parking lot. to ensure safety in the parking lot. But after they drove away, that was something that was concerning to us. But we did allow them to drive home. Yes.
Okay, great. Question from Amy. She may have missed something. Why use Google Docs? Did you pull your rosters from Skyward and then use Google Docs to sign them out? Or were you using them to locate where you had them in your safe areas?
The use of the Google Doc was strictly to lighten the load, the communication load or the traffic that was happening on our walkie-talkies. So we had too much traffic on the airwaves there, so it was really slowing things down. So the Google Doc was strictly a supplement to our walkie-talkies. So when a parent would come in, they'd get to the checkpoint to be reunified, they'd identify themselves, say who they were there for. We would then log in or indicate that student and the location where their parent was in the Google Doc. That Google Doc was then live in the front in the main office, where that student's name was read over the PA and indicated the location where their parent was for them.
All right, that's a great example of being able to adapt there amid the situation. This question from Amber: how did you prevent students from communicating with their parents via cell phones during the lockdown?
Yeah, our policy at this time is for our students to have their phones off and in their lockers. We do allow them to use them to listen. So many phones now have so many functions. So we do allow them during lunch and before school starts to listen to their music or possibly play their video games on their phones. So though our policy states that their phones are supposed to be off and in their lockers, my guess on any given day is at least 50%, if not more, have them on them. I did not prohibit them from doing that. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that I was constantly, between 10, 15, 20 minutes into each of the areas. I don't believe I sat down at all during that day. I mean, we were constantly moving from spot to spot to make sure that that kids were okay. I do think I did mention to kids that had cell phones to just to make sure that if they were nervous and did feel the need to use them, that they did so appropriately. But yeah, that was something that, you really can't stop. Kids are going to have them, and I think it's the message that you deliver to them, and you just hope that what you've taught them as past students and being responsible and doing the right thing, you kind of just hope that they do. And we didn't have, as far as I know, we didn't have any issues with that. There were many parents that called in, and this is something we didn't talk about. I had my social worker answering those phone calls, and really in that time period, there was just one parent that I had to address that our social worker, just had gotten frustrated with, that wouldn't let up. So, yeah, there was some students using their phones.
And at the high school level, I'm certain they were as well. We allow electronic devices, and then on a regular basis, classroom teachers, it's up to their discretion of whether or not students are using them for using them during their class period or not, or whether they're allowed to have them out, based on what's going on, in that class. I'm certain that virtually every student was in some way, shape, or form communicating with their parent, throughout the course of the day or at some point during the course of that day. But again, we relied on classroom teachers to be, good communicators, good decision makers in terms of what capacity those devices were used.
Great. We're just going to go through one more question here before I let you guys sign off. But as we said, any additional questions, we can relay them to Jeff and Jeremy directly. This one's from Paul. Has the police changed how they are going to interact with you in a situation like this? Specifically, it sounded like there was no police presence at the high school and not at the middle school until the afternoon.
We haven't met on that topic in particular, and I'll answer this in two different directions. One, I guess it would have been nice just for peace of mind to have had an officer or two, but as I reflect on it, there was a manhunt going on, and there was 400 to 500 officers out, and it was a fallen brother. So as I reflect back, they were best served at that point hunting down the three individuals that allegedly had killed the officers. So I understand, and it would have been nice, but definitely understandable why they did what they did.
Right, I agree, and the conclusions we've drawn is the same thing. It definitely would be nice and be reassuring, during that time to have an officer, right with us making the decisions along the way. But based on, again, given the circumstances of that day and the scope of what the entire law enforcement community was trying to do, we recognize where he was best serving his need there. So. Going forward, we have formally communicated that with them, but one way or the other. But we recognize why they made that call and made that choice to follow that course of action.
Perfect. All right. Well, Jeff, Jeremy, I want to thank you both so very much for sharing this information with us. Your leadership during this emergency situation was stellar and a great example for other leaders who are interested in what this was like for you both. We're going to go ahead and draw the webinar to a close, and you are free to close the GoToWebinar control panel. As I said, it was recorded, and I will be sending that recording link as well as an evaluation link out to all attendees and those who registered for the webinar today. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining, and you are free to sign out.